"She can't be the shooter," someone said just loud enough for the entire range to hear, and for a moment, no one corrected him, not the instructors, not the observers, not even the timer operator standing by the digital board that still flashed 1742 in bold red numbers beneath the last completed run, the one no one could quite explain yet. 10 steel targets down in under 18 minutes, every hit clean, every shot controlled, every movement precise, and yet the woman standing beside the rifle now didn't look like what any of them expected. Emily Carter stood with her shoulders relaxed, her expression neutral, as if the outcome meant nothing more than another completed task, while a line of recruits whispered behind her, some shaking their heads, others glancing back at the target still swaying slightly in the early morning breeze. The metallic echoes of impact lingering longer than the disbelief in the air. "There's no way," another voice muttered, quieter this time, almost cautious, as if saying it louder might make it less true. The instructor at the far end of the range didn't speak, he just stared at the scoreboard, then back at Emily, then at the rifle resting on the bipod as if it might offer an explanation, but it didn't. Nothing about this made sense to them, not yet, and that was the problem, because 18 minutes earlier, when Emily first walked onto range 12, no one had even bothered to look twice. She had signed in without a word, her name barely noticed on the clipboard, her uniform standard issue, her gear unremarkable, just another soldier passing through another qualification test, except she didn't move like the others, not rushed. Not uncertain, but steady, deliberate, as if every step had already been measured before she took it, the kind of movement that didn't draw attention unless you knew what to look for, and most of them didn't, not the group of young recruits leaning against the railing, not the assistant instructor joking about weekend leave, not even the range officer who glanced up once and then went back to his notes, because on the surface, there was nothing to see, just a quiet woman with a rifle and a slot on the schedule. And yet now, with 10 targets down and the timer still counting down from a number no one thought possible, the entire range had gone still, conversations cut short, assumptions left hanging in the air, and somewhere in that silence, the same thought passed through more than one mind, not spoken this time, but felt clearly enough to change the way they looked at her, because whatever they thought they knew about Emily Carter 18 minutes ago, it wasn't enough anymore. The air had felt different 18 minutes earlier, though no one had noticed it at the time, not when Emily Carter stepped onto the concrete firing line with nothing but a rifle case in one hand and a folded score sheet in the other, the morning sun still low over the berm casting long shadows across the range as a handful of soldiers gathered near the observation rail, their attention scattered between casual conversation and the occasional glance at the schedule board. "You here for the intermediate run?" the assistant instructor had asked without looking up, flipping through a clipboard with routine indifference. Emily gave a small nod, setting her case down with quiet precision before opening it, the hinges barely making a sound. Inside, the rifle rested in perfect alignment, clean, maintained, nothing flashy, just equipment that had been handled with care and consistency over time. "Lane 3, the instructor said, marking her name down as if it were just another entry in a long list. No hesitation, no curiosity, just procedure, and yet the moment she stepped into position, a few heads turned, not out of recognition, but curiosity mixed with skepticism. She did not match the mental picture most of them carried for this kind of test, no loud confidence, no exaggerated movements. Just a stillness that seemed out of place in a space built on noise and competition. "She is running solo," one of the recruits asked under his breath, leaning slightly toward his friend who shrugged with a smirk. "Probably just checking boxes," he replied, the kind of quiet dismissal that lingered longer than intended. Emily did not respond. She adjusted the bipod legs with a subtle shift of her fingers, lowering the rifle until it met the ground with exact balance. Then she lay prone, not hurried, not hesitant, just deliberate, her left hand settling along the stock while her right hand rested lightly near the trigger guard. Her eyes moved once across the field, 10 steel silhouettes spaced across varying distances, each positioned to challenge not just accuracy, but control, wind drift, and timing. A light breeze moved across the range from left to right, barely visible except in the thin line of grass beyond the targets. Emily watched it for a second longer than most would have, then reached forward to make a small adjustment to the scope. "Not dramatic, just enough. You think she even knows the sequence?" another voice whispered, this one louder, edged with amusement. A few chuckles followed, short, dismissive, and quickly fading as the range officer called out, "Shooter ready." Emily did not look up, she simply shifted her breathing, slow and even, her chest rising and falling in controlled rhythm as if the noise around her had already disappeared. "Shooter ready," she said, her voice calm, steady, carrying just enough to be heard without forcing attention. The officer paused for a fraction of a second, then nodded. "Stand by." The timer operator lifted his hand, eyes fixed on the digital display, and in that quiet second before the start signal, the entire range held. A subtle tension that no one could quite explain, not anticipation, not concern, just a moment suspended between assumption and reality, and then the signal sounded, sharp and clean, marking the beginning of something none of them expected to remember. The first shot broke the silence so cleanly that it almost did not register as a disruption. A single controlled crack followed by the distant metallic ring of steel, and for a brief moment, no one reacted, as if their minds needed an extra second to catch up to what had just happened. The nearest recruit blinked and leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing toward the far line where the first target had begun to sway. "Did she hit that?" he asked, not quite believing his own question, but before anyone could answer, the second shot followed, faster this time, just as controlled, just as precise, and the second target responded the same way, a clean drop followed by a subtle swing, and now the murmurs started, low at first, uncertain, the kind of sound people make when they are not ready to admit something has shifted. Emily did not move beyond what was necessary. Her body remained aligned with the rifle, her breathing steady. Each inhale measured, each exhale timed, her finger pressing the trigger with a consistency that looked almost effortless, but there was nothing accidental about it. The third shot came within seconds, then the fourth, each one placed with the same level of control, no wasted motion. No visible adjustment beyond a slight shift of her support hand or a subtle change in angle. "That is not beginner luck," the assistant instructor said under his breath, his tone no longer casual, his attention now fully locked onto the line. The timer continued to count upward, seconds stacking quietly in the corner of the digital board, but Emily was not chasing speed, she was controlling it, pacing each shot with intention, never rushing, never hesitating. The fifth target dropped, then the sixth, and now the range had gone completely still. Conversation stopped, even the wind seemed to fade into the background as every set of eyes focused on the same point, the same figure lying prone with a calm that did not match the growing tension around her. One of the recruits who had laughed earlier shifted uncomfortably, crossing his arms as if trying to find a new position that made sense of what he was seeing. "She has done this before," he muttered, quieter now, less certain. The instructor did not respond, he simply watched, his expression tightening as he began to recognize patterns that were not taught in standard training, the way she compensated for distance without hesitation, the way her timing remained consistent even as the sequence advanced. The seventh shot landed clean, followed by the eighth. And now the disbelief had turned into something else, something closer to realization, not fully formed yet, but impossible to ignore. Emily paused for a fraction of a second before the ninth shot, not out of uncertainty, but calculation, her eyes steady through the scope, tracking something only she seemed to fully understand. And when the shot came, it carried the same quiet authority as the ones before it, another target down, another piece of the assumption breaking apart, and somewhere behind the line, someone let out a slow breath they did not realize they had been holding, because whatever they thought this was at the beginning, it was no longer that, and the final target still stood waiting, alone at the far end of the range, as if it already knew it was next. The final target stood farther than the rest, slightly offset from the line, positioned to force a decision rather than reward routine, and for the first time since the signal, Emily did not fire immediately. Her breathing slowed even further, each inhale drawn carefully through her nose, each exhale released with controlled precision as her finger rested lightly against the trigger, not pulling, not hesitating, simply waiting, the kind of pause that did not come from uncertainty but from calculation. The wind had shifted just enough to matter, barely visible to most, but evident in the faint movement of dust near the base of the berm and the slight tremble of the distant steel. The timer continued to climb, seconds passing quietly, yet no one spoke. No one dared to break the stillness that had settled over the range. "What is she doing?" one of the recruits whispered, though his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. The assistant instructor raised a hand without looking back, signaling silence, his eyes fixed entirely on Emily, watching for something he could not quite name yet, something beyond standard technique. Emily adjusted her cheek weld by a fraction, her left hand shifting just enough to stabilize the rifle against the ground, her right elbow anchoring into position as if locking her body into a single aligned structure. The scope remained steady, unwavering, her gaze fixed through the glass with a focus that did not flicker, and then, without any visible build-up, the shot came, clean, controlled, almost quiet compared to the weight it carried, and for a split second, nothing happened. The delay stretching just long enough to make a few of them doubt, and then the distant steel responded, the final target dropping with the same certainty as the others, completing the sequence with no variation, no inconsistency, just precision from start to finish. The timer stopped seconds later, locking in a number that no one on that range had expected to see that morning. A number that shifted everything without a single word needing to be spoken. For a moment, the silence held, heavier. Now, not from confusion but from realization, the kind that arrives all at once and leaves no room for denial. One of the recruits let out a quiet breath, lowering his arms as if the posture itself no longer made sense. "That is not possible," he said, though there was no conviction behind it anymore, just an echo of what he had believed before. The instructor finally stepped forward, his boots pressing against the gravel with a measured pace, his eyes moving from the targets back to Emily, studying her as if trying to reconcile what he had just witnessed with the information he thought he had. "Range is clear," the officer called out, his voice steady but different now, more deliberate, as if acknowledging something had shifted. Emily remained in position for a second longer before slowly lifting her head, her expression unchanged. Calm, almost detached, as though the outcome had never been in question for her, she cleared the chamber, secured the rifle, and stood up in one smooth motion, no rush, no display, just the quiet completion of a task, and as she turned slightly to step back from the line. The eyes that had once dismissed her now followed her movement with a different kind of attention, not loud, not exaggerated, but undeniable, because whatever assumptions had filled that space before she arrived had just been replaced by something far more difficult to ignore. For several seconds after the final target dropped, no one moved, the kind of silence that did not come from discipline but from recalculation, as if every person on that range was quietly revising something they had believed just minutes earlier. The digital timer still held its number, glowing in red against the morning light, and even that seemed louder now, more present. As though it was forcing everyone to acknowledge what had just happened, the assistant instructor finally exhaled and took a slow step forward, glancing once more at the targets. Then back at Emily, his posture no longer casual. "Reset the range," he said, though his voice carried a measured tone, less command, more confirmation. Two recruits moved quickly toward the control panel, but their movements lacked the earlier ease. Each glance they exchanged carried a question neither of them voiced. One of them, the same one who had laughed earlier, paused for a fraction of a second before pressing the reset switch, watching the steel plates rise back into position one by one, as if expecting them to behave differently this time, as if the explanation might somehow reveal itself through repetition. It did not. Emily lifted her rifle case from the ground and began placing each component back with the same care she had shown before the run, her hands steady, her attention focused, not on the people around her, but on the process itself, the routine that existed long before this moment and would continue long after. The instructor stopped a few feet away from her, his eyes scanning her posture, her gear, the small details that might explain what he had witnessed. "Where did you train?" he asked, the question direct, but not confrontational. Emily paused briefly, just enough to acknowledge the question, then closed the latch on her case with a soft click. "Various assignments," she replied, her tone even, offering nothing more than the minimum required. The instructor held her gaze for a second longer, as if weighing whether to push further, then gave a slight nod, not agreement, but recognition that the answer, incomplete as it was, had been intentional. Behind them, the recruits had begun to regroup, their voices low, no longer filled with easy humor. "That timing was not standard," one of them said quietly. Another shook his head, still watching Emily. "That was not timing, that was control," he corrected, and the distinction hung in the air, subtle, but important. The range officer stepped closer to the scoreboard, reviewing the recorded time, then writing it down with deliberate care, as if documenting something that would need to be explained later. "You are aware that run sets a new mark for this course," he said without turning around, his voice carrying across the line. Emily adjusted the strap on her case and gave a small nod, not an acknowledgement of the record, but of the statement itself. Understood, she replied, nothing more. No satisfaction, no reaction that matched the significance of what had just been said, and that, more than anything, shifted the way they looked at her, because the performance had been undeniable, but her response to it made it clear that for her, it had never been the point. The instructor glanced once more at the line, then back at Emily, his expression settling into something quieter, more measured. As if the evaluation had moved beyond the targets and into something less visible. You are scheduled for additional evaluation this afternoon, he said, not as a question, but as a decision. Emily met his gaze, steady, composed, and gave a single nod. I will be there, she said, and with that, she turned slightly, stepping away from the firing line with the same controlled movement she had carried through every moment of the run, leaving behind a range that felt different now, not because of what had happened, but because of what they had just learned without being told. By early afternoon, the range felt different, not because of the weather or the schedule, but because word had traveled faster than protocol. Small fragments of the morning had already moved through the base, passed quietly from one conversation to another. Each version slightly altered but carrying the same core detail. A shooter no one recognized had reset expectations without saying a word, and now, at the far end of the training complex, a smaller evaluation lane had been cleared, not publicly announced, not posted on the main board, but prepared with intention, the kind of setup reserved for observation rather than routine qualification. Emily arrived without escort, her steps measured, her gear minimal, the same rifle case, the same composed posture, as if the transition from morning to afternoon had not introduced anything new for her, only a continuation of something already understood. Two senior instructors stood near the observation point, their conversation low and controlled, both glancing toward the lane as she approached. That is her, one of them said quietly, not asking, simply confirming. The other nodded once, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her movement, not looking for obvious signs, but for the absence of them, the lack of tension, the lack of performance. She does not carry it like someone trying to prove something, he said, more to himself than to anyone else. Emily stopped at the designated mark and placed her case down, opening it with the same deliberate care. Each motion consistent with the morning, not rehearsed, not exaggerated, just efficient. One of the instructors stepped forward, his tone neutral but direct. This is not a standard run, he said. Targets will be varied, timing will not be announced, you respond when ready. Emily looked up briefly, meeting his gaze without hesitation. Understood, she replied, her voice steady, offering no question. No need for clarification. The second instructor moved to the control panel, adjusting settings that were not visible from the line, distances changing, angles shifting, the sequence no longer predictable. This was not about repetition, it was about adaptability, the kind that could not be trained in a single environment. She is not being tested for accuracy, the first instructor said quietly, watching her as she adjusted her position. She is being tested for awareness. Emily lowered herself into position, her body aligning with the ground, her breathing settling into a controlled rhythm that seemed to slow the entire space around her. The environment was different now, less noise, fewer observers, but the weight of attention had increased, more focused, more intentional, and yet she did not react to it. Her attention fixed entirely on the field ahead, where the targets had not yet appeared. A brief pause settled over the lane, not empty, but filled with expectation, and then, without warning, the first target emerged, not directly in front, but off to the side, partially obscured, a test not of speed, but of recognition. Emily did not rush, her eyes tracked the movement, her body adjusted with subtle precision, the rifle following her line of sight as if connected. The shot came clean, controlled, and immediate. The target responded, and before the sound fully faded, another appeared at a different angle, farther out, requiring a shift not just in position, but in calculation. And again, she responded without hesitation, not faster, but exactly as fast as necessary. The instructors exchanged a brief glance, not surprised, but confirming something that had not yet been spoken, because what they were watching was not a continuation of the morning, it was something deeper, something that did not rely on repetition, but on instinct shaped by experience. And as the sequence continued, each target appearing without pattern, without warning, the difference between training and mastery became impossible to ignore, not through explanation, but through the quiet consistency of her actions. The sequence continued without pattern, each new target appearing at a different distance, a different angle, forcing constant recalibration, and yet Emily did not show any sign of adjustment beyond what was necessary. Her movements remained minimal, efficient, as if the unpredictability itself had already been accounted for before it even began. The third target of the evaluation appeared low and partially shielded by terrain, requiring not just a shift in aim but a complete repositioning of her upper body. She transitioned smoothly, her elbows anchoring into the ground as she rotated, the rifle following in one continuous motion, no pause, no visible hesitation. The shot came clean, and before the instructors could exchange another glance, the fourth target emerged behind her previous line of sight, forcing a reversal that would disrupt most shooters, but not her. She adjusted again, slower this time, not because she lacked speed, but because she was measuring something more precise. The wind had shifted again, subtle but enough to matter at distance. Her breathing slowed further, and when she fired, the result matched the pattern established earlier, consistent, controlled. Exact. She is not reacting, one of the instructors said quietly, his voice low but certain. She is anticipating. The other nodded, his eyes never leaving the scope line, because the difference between those two states was what separated training from experience, and what they were watching now was no longer a question of skill, but of exposure to conditions that could not be replicated in standard exercises. The fifth and sixth targets appeared in quick succession, closer together, designed to force urgency, but Emily did not accelerate beyond her rhythm. She maintained the same cadence, each shot placed with intention, refusing to be pulled into the pace of the test itself, and that control shifted the balance entirely, because the evaluation was no longer leading her, she was defining it. The seventh target appeared farther out than the others, beyond what most would consider optimal for this type of run, a placement that demanded both confidence and adjustment. Emily paused again, not long, just enough to register the distance, her fingers making a slight correction on the scope, a movement so small it might have gone unnoticed if not for the result that followed. The shot landed with the same quiet certainty. And now even the instructors had stopped speaking, their focus sharpened into something closer to recognition, not surprise, but confirmation of a pattern they had both begun to see forming. The eighth target appeared abruptly, almost as an interruption, but Emily transitioned without disruption, her posture stable, her breathing unchanged, and when the shot came, it carried the same consistency as the first. As if the entire sequence existed within a single controlled system rather than a series of individual actions. This is not recent training, the first instructor said under his breath, his tone measured, almost analytical. This is long-term repetition under variable conditions. The second instructor did not respond, but his silence carried agreement, because there was no other explanation that fit what they were observing. And as the ninth target appeared, slightly elevated and offset from the rest, Emily adjusted once more, her movement still precise, still controlled, and in that moment, it became clear that whatever this evaluation had been intended to reveal, it was no longer uncovering something new. It was confirming something that had already been there long before she stepped onto this range. The ninth target dropped with the same quiet certainty as the others, leaving only one remaining in the sequence, but this one did not appear immediately, and the delay itself felt intentional, as if the system was waiting to see whether time would disrupt her rhythm or force a premature adjustment. Emily remained still, her breathing unchanged, her focus steady through the scope, not searching, not anticipating blindly, but observing with a patience that seemed unaffected by the pause. The instructors did not speak, but their attention sharpened, both aware that this final moment would not test her ability to react, but her ability to remain controlled when nothing was happening. Seconds passed, stretching just enough to introduce doubt in less experienced shooters, the kind of silence that made people second-guess their position, their timing, their readiness. But Emily did not shift, not even slightly, her posture held as if anchored, her awareness extending beyond the visible field. And then, without warning, the final target appeared at an angle none of the previous ones had used, positioned farther out and partially offset by elevation, forcing both distance calculation and angle correction at once. It was the kind of placement designed to disrupt consistency, to expose hesitation or overcorrection, but Emily's response remained aligned with everything that had come before, her body adjusted in one smooth motion, not rushed, not delayed, her left hand stabilizing the rifle as her right hand settled with precise control. Her breathing slowed even further, a deliberate pause that seemed to compress the entire sequence into a single moment of focus, and when the shot came, it carried the same controlled execution, the same quiet authority, the final target responding with the same predictable result, completing the sequence without deviation. The lane fell silent again, but this silence was different from the one that followed the morning run. It was no longer confusion or disbelief, it was recognition. The instructors exchanged a brief glance, not surprised, but acknowledging something that had now been fully confirmed. One of them stepped forward slightly, his posture more formal than before. "That concludes the evaluation," he said, his voice steady, but carrying a weight that had not been there at the start. Emily remained in position for a moment longer before lifting her head, her expression unchanged, calm, composed, as if the entire sequence had unfolded exactly as expected. She secured the rifle with the same deliberate care, her movements consistent, controlled, never drawing attention to themselves. The instructors approached together now, no longer observing from a distance. Their attention focused entirely on her, not with skepticism, but with a level of respect that had not been present. "Earlier, you have been through advanced operational environments," one of them said, not asking, but stating what had become evident through observation. Emily paused briefly, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Yes," she replied, her tone even, offering no elaboration. The second instructor nodded slowly, as if confirming something in his own assessment. "That level of control does not come from training alone," he said quietly, and for the first time, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, not dramatic, but clear enough to be felt, because what had started as an evaluation had ended as recognition, not of a single performance, but of a background that had never been introduced. And as Emily closed her case and prepared to step away from the lane, the space around her felt different, not because she had changed, but because the way they saw her no longer matched what they had assumed when she first arrived. The lane remained quiet even after the evaluation ended, but the silence no longer felt uncertain. It carried a different weight now, something settled, something understood without needing to be explained. The instructors stood a few steps away as Emily secured the final latch on her case, neither of them rushing to speak, as if choosing their words carefully in a space that no longer allowed for assumptions. The first instructor finally broke the silence, his voice low but clear. "Your file does not reflect what we just observed." It was not an accusation, not even a question, just a statement placed deliberately between them. Emily adjusted the strap over her shoulder, her posture unchanged, her expression calm. "It was not meant to," she replied, her tone even, offering nothing more than the truth without explanation. The second instructor glanced toward the range, then back at her, his eyes narrowing slightly as if aligning what he had seen with something he had encountered before. "Tier 1 attachment," he said quietly, not asking, simply identifying. Emily did not confirm it directly, but her lack of reaction was answer enough, and in that moment, both men understood that what they had witnessed was not an exception, not an anomaly, but a standard carried from a different environment, one that did not advertise itself, one that did not require recognition to exist. Behind them, a small group of personnel had gathered at a distance, their earlier confidence replaced by a quiet awareness that they were looking at someone they had misread entirely. No one laughed now, no one whispered. The shift had already happened. The first instructor exhaled slowly and gave a slight nod, not as approval, but as acknowledgement. "You will be reassigned for Advanced Operations Review," he said, his tone measured, formal, the kind of decision that was not made lightly. Emily met his gaze for a brief moment, then nodded once. "Understood," she said, her voice steady, as if the outcome had already been expected. There was no visible reaction, no sense of accomplishment, only acceptance of the next step. The second instructor watched her for a moment longer, then spoke in a quieter tone, almost reflective. "Most people try to prove something when they step onto a range like this," he said. "You did not." Emily paused briefly, her eyes steady. "There was nothing to prove," she replied, and the simplicity of the answer carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it reframed everything they had seen, not as a performance, not as a demonstration,